I've put out a number of films on the problems assailing education, and they're also discussed in depth, along with many other topics, in my critically acclaimed books, available on the links below. Anyway, those issues were laid bare when Kathleen Stock was driven from Sussex University by the relentless bullying, abuse and harassment she received from the trans community. And they're also apparent in the instructive tale of Peter Boghossian. Peter was a philosophy teacher at Portland State University, ground zero in the woke mania that's devastated the West. Boghossian described a slide into that process. Over time, the university became less of a symposium and more of a church. It became less of a place where people went to engage with ideas, to think through issues, and to try to figure out what was true. And it became more of a place where the catechism reigned. More of a place where there were right answers to moral questions. People at the university felt that they knew the answers, and they tested you on them. I just couldn't maintain my integrity there any longer. It was less about specific instances. It was like a cultural soup that kept getting thicker and thicker over time. Boghossian believed in exposing his students to a wide variety of opinions, to get them to engage with others' views, to cultivate them in thinking, which, after all, is the entire point of philosophy. But he noticed students becoming increasingly hostile to this approach. They became flippant and dismissive about the questions he hoped to raise. They scowled at him as if he had some sort of moral problem, rather than being an individual who was engaging with ideas. They clearly believed that he was just a bad person, simply because he was asking questions. And students even started running from his class, screaming and freaking out. In Boghossian's atheism class, they looked at Yasmin Mohammed's book, Unveiled, which is about how liberals have failed Muslim reformers and women. They looked at some of Sarah Hyder's work on ex-Muslims. But the mortified students quickly began hurling accusations of racism. Boghossian noticed how, over time, the students, faculty and administration became less tolerant of diverse viewpoints, in spite of their incessant talk about diversity. Boghossian is clear that he is not a victim. As he said, if I'd stopped asking questions, if I'd just bowed my head and put my pronouns in my bio, everything would have been fine. But I made a conscious, deliberate choice not to do that. It's a stunning admission. A confession that only abject surrender to a Maoist-style tyranny is acceptable at university. That in the halls of learning, a bastion of questioning and free inquiry, all values have been subverted, and that the only acceptable course is now capitulation to bullying indoctrination, that all must bow to a fake and distorted worldview. It's terrifying that it's come to this. Yet millions still deny that there is any problem at all. As Boghossian says, free speech and open inquiry are under attack. But it's not just that. Those things are proxies. The real issue is that people have been robbed of their cognitive liberty. People don't seek truth anymore. They view the university as an ideology mill. Their goal is to get people to adopt certain moral conclusions. That should terrify you, even if you agree with those conclusions. It's easy to see why this has happened. Certainty is comforting. And it's also reassuring to claim victim status, or to side with a victim. That way, all blame can be placed elsewhere. It's always somebody else's fault. Yet personal responsibility is the cornerstone of any successful civilization. And as Voltaire said, doubt may not be a pleasant condition, but certainty is absurd. The radicals' binary view of oppressor and oppressed is a product of what Kierkegaard considered the most dangerous of mental faults: laziness and impatience. Laziness of mind results in an unwillingness to face complex and unsettling concepts or ideas, while impatience leads to a rush to embrace comforting, all-inclusive theories without due rigour or critical analysis. In his resignation letter, Boghossian was clear that "I never once believed, nor do I now, that the purpose of instruction was to lead my students to a particular conclusion. Rather, I sought to create the conditions for rigorous thought, to help them gain the tools to hunt and furrow out their own conclusions. This is why I became a teacher, and why I love teaching. But brick by brick, the university has made this kind of intellectual exploration impossible. It's transformed a bastion of free inquiry into a social justice factory whose only inputs were race, gender and victimhood, and whose only outputs were grievance and division. Students at Portland State are not being taught to think. Rather, they've been trained to mimic the moral certainty of ideologues. Faculty and administrators have abdicated the university's truth-seeking mission and instead drive intolerance of divergent beliefs and opinions. This has created a culture of offence, where students are now afraid to speak openly and honestly. Boghossian saw colleagues being attacked when they requested evidence, asked questions, or recommended any texts written by white European males. He noticed that the primary text of the critical theorists reflected the postulates of an ideology, but they were free from any insights based on evidence. He began to challenge the culture that had swamped the institution, so he was attacked, shouted down, and bullied. No one was interested in engaging with his ideas. They were just determined to intimidate and silence him. Investigations and accusations were launched against him. Despicable lies were spread. But his accusers were protected and given anonymity. Even though he was ultimately cleared, Boghossian was treated as if he was guilty. He was warned to avoid any future discussion of protected classes, and to keep his opinions on those subjects to himself. A remarkable instruction for a teacher. Alongside James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, he published some papers to expose the flaws in the thinking of his critics, and the attacks escalated. Students carved swastikas into his office door and threw around bags of feces. But when the university acted, it was against him, not the perpetrators. The administrators filed formal charges against him, while mobs shut down events with guest speakers like Brett Weinstein, Heather Hine, James Damore, and Carl Benjamin. The university did nothing about those mobs, or about the students who spat on and threatened Boghossian on campus. His colleagues began telling students to avoid his classes. I've worked in and cherished education my entire life. When I went to university in the 90s, it was the best thing that had ever happened to me. But if a young person asked my advice now, I'd tell them not to go. And that breaks my heart. As Boghossian concluded, it's very easy to rip shit up and tear shit down. But it's more difficult to build things and to create institutions that matter, which safeguard the rights of the most vulnerable. Because of a radically heightened sense of identity, we are becoming more divided. We are teaching people to see each other on the basis of their immutable characteristics. I don't know what good people think this is doing. It needs to stop right now. We have institutionalised policies that are not just harmful and hurtful, but that also don't work. We know this stuff hurts people. And if we don't knock it off, we are in for a reckoning.